What if Doctor Who hadn't been axed in 1989? That is something many have tried to guess at, and now it's my turn. I'll be going through this concept at the rate of 1 season per episode. These videos are based on information released by John Nathan Turner, Andrew Cartmel, Ben Aaronovitch, and a lot, and I mean a lot, of guesswork. Season 47 would have aired between the 18th of September 2010 and the 20th of November 2010. This season will be made up of 10 90-minute episodes. Like season 45, there would have been a Christmas special airing a few months later on the 25th of December 2010. This would be the first season to feature David Suchet as the 13th Doctor, as well as Juliet Landau as Zenna and Dougray Scott as Chris Parsons. All three were previously introduced in Doctor Who Vengeance. Robert Sherman would have continued his role as script editor for the season, as would Gary Russell as producer and Iris Stephen Bear and Faith Penhall as executive producers. Martin Campbell, the director of Doctor Who Vengeance, would join on as an executive producer for this season as well. While maintaining the same production team and format as the previous season, season 47 would have a drastically different tone and feel. The intention by Sherman and Russell would be to harken back to the feel of the William Hartnell years with an older Doctor and both a male and female companion. One of the results of the Doctor's regeneration, as he's on his last regeneration now, was decided to be a long-term confusion over the TARDIS controls. So like in the Hartnell years, the Doctor can't quite pilot it properly and they have no idea where they will end up. It was also decided that the season would feature one pure historical story to recreate this tone. Pure historicals had not been seen in the show since season 4, so this would be a drastic experiment. Also, to keep the audience on board with the new Doctor and new companions, Sherman and Russell decided to have half the stories include returning villains from the show's past. These include the Daleks, the Wirren, the Monk, the Celestial Toymaker, the Valiard, and the Weeping Angels. The season would feature a new title sequence which would be designed to be drastically different to Who titles of the past few years, as Sherman had felt that ever since season 33 all the titles had had quite a slow pace, and even though 44 to 46 sped up eventually, a fast pace would be needed throughout to introduce this kinetic feel. So we asked for the new title sequence to be approximately just 40 seconds in length compared to the 84 seconds of the previous seasons, and for there not to be slow shots of space at the opening which had become commonplace since season 35. And while they were replaced by the Doctors in the Redstone era, they still kept the same feel. This time the sequence just dived straight into the Vortex, and for the first time ever the cast names are before the Doctor Who logo in the title sequence. Also for the first time since season 37, the TARDIS would feature in the titles. This time the latest exterior design which was introduced in Doctor Who Vengeance. To go along with this updated title sequence, a new title card was devised for the episodes, which sees 3D text used for the first time for an episode title on Doctor Who, and then the sequence ends with the camera flying inside the TARDIS, which would take us into the episode. Like season 46, the season will be episodic and not have an arc as such, and just continue seeing the Doctor, Zenna and Chris have adventures. The only real arc would be the Doctor trying to get Chris back to Cambridge but never quite managing it, and other character arcs developing throughout the season. Nixai 7 is the last colony planet of the ancient Foul race, and it has quickly become a refuge for races in a similar position, becoming a hub of trade and commerce over time. However, disaster strikes when the Daleks discover it and quickly invade it. For many, their only hope of survival is decent medical care, as slave working conditions of the Dalek regime are appalling. But when you help people to survive under the rule of the Daleks, are you actually helping the Daleks? When the Doctor, Zen and Chris arrive, that is a question that resonates to try and keep people alive. This story would start off the season with a bang. The TARDIS lands on the foul colony planet Nixis 7, immediately after the events of Doctor Who Vengeance, and as evident, the Doctor is still experiencing post-regenerative stress, and it is perhaps even worse than in Vengeance, and therefore most of the action has to be carried out by Zeno and Chris. This story would be a Dalek story, and would be for the first time since Power of the Daleks that the Doctor's first story had been with Daleks. This story would deal with the ethical implications of helping people survive when enslaved by the Daleks, and this would be summed up by a character the Doctor, Zen and Chris would meet, Liv Chenka, who came to Nixis 7 before the Dalek occupation and is now helping the foul slaves stay alive, which in turn keeps the Dalek slave force alive. Towards the end of the story, she sacrifices her life to save the Doctor, Zen and Chris. This story also features the surprise return of Davros, who unknowingly helps the Doctor through his post-regenerative stress by reminding the Doctor of what he knows. The Doctor, Zen and Chris arrive in 1599 England after viewing a performance of Shakespeare's latest play. The time travellers are beset by apparent sorcery. At a threat of annihilation from a species from the Dark Times, the TARDIS teams have to establish whether there is a connection between a witch they've met and Shakespeare's Love Labours Won, a play that was legendarily lost to time. This story would see the TARDIS trio travel back into 1599 where they meet William Shakespeare. It features such Shakespearean enemies as witches, which actually turn out to be aliens called Carrionites. It would be both Zen and Chris's first adventure into the past, and would be especially impactful for Chris, being a fan of Shakespeare's work, and he constantly drops references to both, at this point, past and future Shakespeare plays. The TARDIS team arrive on a beautiful paradise-like planet, full of the most luxurious landscapes and pleasure facilities. Perhaps after such dangerous adventures, the Doctor, Zen and Chris can unwind and enjoy themselves. However, something is wrong. It's too nice, it's too good, and there seems to be an unsettling power at work. This story takes place in the future on a beautiful pleasure planet where the Doctor, Zen and Chris just go to rest. However, they discover there is a hidden away slave class controlled by the leaders of the planet, who are free rich business tycoons. When, about 15 minutes in, the Doctor, Zen and Chris begin to uncover the truth, the story begins to turn into a Doctor helps a rebel story, and they begin to stage a revolution, and by the end of the story the slave class take over and the planet ceases to be a perfect pleasure planet, and instead the facilities for the tourists turn into homes for the former slaves. The subplot of this episode would focus on Chris being captured and made part of the slave force. Rival gangs turn streets into battlegrounds, and the Doctor and his friends are caught in the crossfire. They find themselves separated and lost in the cold. As the hunt for a fugitive turns ever more desperate, a blizzard descends. The snow keeps falling, and soon it will prove as deadly as any weapon. This story will be the first pure historical since the Highlanders, and focuses around the Great Blizzard of 1888 in New York, and would have been filmed mostly in New York on location and in other places in the United States which double for New York. Immediately, the TARDIS crew is split up, and a lot of the story focuses on them finding each other again. The Doctor is arrested and Zenlet is kidnapped, so it's up to Chris to try and get them all back together again, making him pretty much the primary protagonist for this episode. The main enemy in the story is the extreme weather, and the rest just focuses on the gangs in New York at the time, and none of those characters are black and white, and more just shades of grey. This episode would have received mixed reactions, and some would have loved it in its return to focusing more on actual history, and some would have hated it, finding it boring and lacking a proper enemy. The year is 16,127. 4 decades have passed since the colonists of Nova Beacon returned to repopulate the once devastated Earth, and the chosen few are finding the business of survival tough. Far beyond the sterile safety of the sanitized Nova City, transmat scientist Roger Butchman has brought his family to an island surrounded by what they call Loch Lomond, hoping to re-establish the colony he was forced to abandon many years before. But something else resides in the loch. a pestilent alien infestation that the Doctor, beaming in from Nova City, remembers only too well from his time aboard the Beacon. The Whirring are back, and they're hungry. This story would feature the return of the Whirring, last seen in Season 44's Whirring Dawn, and would be almost a direct sequel to their first appearance in Season 12's The Ark in Space. It would be set on a remote Scottish island where there are 400 Whirring frozen inside the lock. It would be extremely creepy and play on that alien feel even more than the previous Whirring stories had in the past. It would also show how humanity is doing 40 years on from The Ark in Space. Island 1006. Strange things have been happening at the isolated Abbey of KELLS. Disembodied voices, unexplained disappearances, sudden death. The monks whisper of imps and demons. Could the Lord of Death himself be stalking these hallowed cloisters? The Doctor and his companions find themselves in the midst of a medieval mystery. At its heart is a book, perhaps the most important book in the world, the Book of KELLS. This story would focus around the Gospel book, the Book of KELLS, and the mystery of its brief disappearance from the Abbey of KELLS in 1006. It would feature the return of the monk, last seen in Season 45. This time it would be played by Toby Jones, who we wouldn't realise is playing the monk until about 15 minutes into this story. This would be a near pure historical, except for the inclusion of the monk, who is a sci-fi element here. The Doctor, Zenna and Chris land on a desolate planet which holds a time and space rift. The TARDIS needs to recharge for at least 24 hours. The Doctor goes back into the TARDIS to get his magnifying glass when the TARDIS dematerialises, leaving Zenna and Chris stranded. The Doctor soon lands back on the planet, but far in the future, when an entire civilization has been born from Chris and Zenna. Can the Doctor, in any good will, go back in time to change the events and stop this civilization from ever existing? This story focuses on the Doctor accidentally leaving Chris and Zenna behind on a desolate planet which over many thousands of years creates a civilization of people born from originally Chris and Zenna. A lot of time is spent exploring this civilization, and the Doctor eventually finds Zenna on her last incarnation, and we see her die. She tells him, please don't go back and change this. The Doctor, however, faces the moral dilemma. Should he go back and take Chris and Zenna back to the TARDIS mere moments after he disappeared and change history, or leave them stranded there to create all of this? The Doctor is soon distracted by an alien race which starts an invasion of the planet, a race the Doctor has never heard of before, called the Vex. Eventually, even with the Doctor's help, everyone on the planet is killed, leaving the place a graveyard. Impulsively, the Doctor returns to save Chris and Zenna and change history so those people never even lived in the first place. The decision haunts the Doctor, and he doesn't know whether it was the right thing to do or not. He doesn't tell Zenna or Chris initially, however this character arc continues throughout the series, with them eventually finding out in a future episode later on. This story is notable for being penned by executive producer Ira Steven Behr and his writing partner Hans Bleimer. Everyone knows that Kowloon Manor is haunted, so of course everyone in the village was suspicious when an eccentric older man and a strange man and woman moved in, and haven't spoken or seen anyone since, not even to go to the shops. Something evil is at work there, and one bright, plucky villager, Zoe Poole, is curious enough to investigate. This episode is a Doctor and Companion light episode, and sees young woman Zoe Poole try to uncover the truth about the strange people living in the manor at the edge of her village, who are of course the Doctor, Zenna and Chris. Zoe and many of the villagers believe that the manor is haunted, and they aren't far off. The Doctor, Zenna and Chris are in fact there as they investigate an apparent ghost in the house, who they worked out is in fact a time traveller who has been trapped in a pocket universe, and they are trying to free her. They are working there to build a machine which can be fitted into the TARDIS, which will allow them to travel to that dimension. Zoe gets caught up in all of this and mistakes them for villains and tries to stop them. Eventually, it's explained to her what's going on, and she ends up going to the pocket universe herself to rescue the time traveller and take them back to our own universe. When the Doctor, Zenna and Chris leave, they give the manor to Zoe as a gift. The Dr. Zen and Chris thought they were time travelers, saving civilizations, getting into scrapes and doing a lot of running. However, imagine their horror if they woke up and it appeared as if it was all a dream. That's what happens to the Doctor, Zen, and Chris as they wake up on Earth separated by continents and oceans, and none of them are content that it was all a dream. The three of them try and unite and find a way out this trap, while also integrating themselves into their new lives. This story sees the Doctor, Zen, and Chris wake up living ordinary lives. The Doctor and Zen are completely invented, however Chris wakes up in his lives before the events of Doctor Who Vengeance back at Cambridge. The three are living three different lives, but still have the memories they have, and everything they're experiencing is telling them that it's just a dream, and for Chris the most, he begins to believe it. Zen has a harder time but seems to come round, and the Doctor just won't accept it. Eventually they all manage to find each other and unite. Turns out to be a Vishklar from the Sereti dimension, known as the Nightmare Man, who trapped them in this dream to sedate them while he uses their life force to pull himself into this dimension. The Doctor, Zen, and Chris manage to defeat him and sending him back into his dimension. The episode ends with the Nightmare Man alone in pitch blackness when a tall figure covered in shadow walks up to him. We hear his voice say, simply, "Join me, and together we shall seek vengeance." And then we see him walk out the shadows, and we see that it's the Valeyard. The TARDIS is pulled out of time onto a forgotten merciless planet, housing nothing but a castle. The Doctor, Zen, and Chris have no choice but to enter, as their horror, they find that it's the home of one of the Doctor's worst foes, the Toymaker. The Doctor and his companions are now forced to play the game set out for them, endlessly revolving around the labyrinth of the castle, finding themselves going up against illusions, tricks, traps, riddles, and time falling apart into chaos. This episode is the season finale and features the return of the Toymaker, whose last and only appearance was in the season 3 story The Celestial Toymaker. The Doctor, Zen, and Chris are forced to play his games once more and fight for their lives. The story borders on just being a remake of The Celestial Toymaker, which works for the most part, as the original story was so long ago. And while an animated version would exist, it would still nearly be completely missing in its original form. However, the story is shaken up in its last 15 minutes when the Toymaker introduces his three friends, the Monk, the Nightmare Man, and the Valeyard. They use the opportunity to torture the Doctor's companions in the most horrific games possible, and Chris ends up losing his arm. The Doctor is then taken out the game and brought to the four of them. The Valeyard explains that he has just come from the events of Trial of a Time Lord, and that he was created by the Rogue during the Doctor's last regeneration. The Valeyard also explains that he's adapted technology from the Monk's TARDIS, the Toymaker's toys, and the Nightmare Man's powers to create a parallel universe, Maker. He explains they can create a whole universe based upon whatever they want. They laugh and point a gun-shaped device at the Doctor. They say, "We've created a few universes, some good, some utterly terrible, and some completely mad. This gun will send you into one of them, and it'll be random, and then you'll be trapped there, for all time. It's Russian roulette." Then the Valeyard shoots the gun, and the Doctor disappears. We then cut to the Doctor, on the ground of a road. It's snowing. He looks up and recognises it as Trafalgar Square, and sees Nelson's column. Then he looks away and looks back at Nelson, and looks back, and Nelson has slightly moved position. Smash cut on the Doctor's face, and cut to closing credits. A caption reads, "The Doctor return at Christmas, and hark, the weeping angels sing." Professor Fleming hates Christmas. She always spends it in some fancy hotel with her detestable, ungrateful family who'd rather spend their time shouting at each other than giving her a second glance. Like usual, she decides to escape the action and she goes on a late night stroll through the dark, snowy depths of the city. However, she must be going mad this year, as she could have sworn she saw a statue move. And when a strange old man walks past, he tries to warn her off. From that moment on, she gets entangled in an adventure she'll never forget. This episode is the Christmas special for 2010 and continues directly on from where we left off in the first game. It It would star actor Julie Walters as Professor Fleming, the temporary companion for the story, as Zen and Chris are still in the Toymaker's castle. It would also feature the returning villain of the Weeping Angels, last seen in season 38's Night of the Angels. As a result of this, Stephen Moffat was asked by Robert Shearman to come in and advise on the use of the angels within the story, as he was the character's originator. Well, the story was actually penned by script editor Robert Shearman and executive producer Ivor Stephen Bear. The story would open with a pre-title sequence that would focus on the Professor. She'd be sat in an armchair in a really posh hotel room on Christmas Day around 7 or 8 o'clock, and all her grandchildren would be screaming and fighting, etc. She tries to say something and can't get a word in. She storms off on a walk, muttering to herself, "I wish they'd just go away," and walks out the hotel. She walks down the street, snow everywhere, and walks past some angel statues. And she swears it moves between her initially looking at it and her looking at it again. And then she blinks, and it begins to move towards her. And then a stranger comes up to her and says, "Don't blink." He introduces himself as the Doctor, and she says, "Well, I'm the Professor." And he asks Professor who, and she says, "No, it's Fleming now." And we cut to the opening titles. And after it, we see the two of them mere minutes later running away from the angel. Not very well, as they are both two older people. The rest of the story focuses on the Doctor and the Professor as they battle the Weeping Angels through Christmas night, eventually trapping them and removing all of them from the planet. It was revealed during the second half of the episode that Professor Fleming's maiden name was Who, and her first name was Susan. The Doctor realises what's going on and asks if she had a grandfather who travelled in time, and she says that he invented a time machine called TARDIS, which looked like an old police box. The Doctor smiles and just simply says, "Hello." Susan asks how it can be. The Doctor explains he's from a parallel universe and explains about the Valiard and the Toymaker and how they created this universe. The Doctor explains that the Toymaker and the Valiard probably thought it was hysterical, making him Doctor Who. Over the course of the remainder of the episode, Susan comes to realise the importance of her family and her grandfather, albeit a different version, but still to her recognisably him. She goes home to her family more happy and appreciative of them. The Doctor manages to find a way out of the universe with Susan's help through finding Doctor Who's TARDIS. Inside, there's a painstakingly accurate recreation of the set, and the Doctor uses TARDIS to cross the barriers of one dimension to another, and he makes his way back to the Toymaker's castle. And there, the episode ends on another cliffhanger. This episode would have been a joyful treat for fans and casual audiences on Christmas Day, from Julie Walters as Professor Susan Fleming, to her identity being a grown-up Susan from the Cushing movies, to the movies themselves being canonised, to the recreation of the Cushing TARDIS set, to the return of the Weeping Angels, as well as a mix of horror and humour. This episode would have been a standout of all time, and on top of this it would have received a viewing figure of 11.8 million viewers. The final two episodes of this season make up the two parts of a three-parter, the finale, the Christmas special, and season 48's opener. This would be a risky move on Shearman and Russell's part, but ultimately a rewarding one. It was made sure that the Christmas special would be more disconnected than the other two parts, telling its own story, and you could just watch it without having to watch the others. The end credits of this episode would feature a continuity announcement informing the viewer that the Cushing movies are available to buy on DVD and Blu-ray. This season as a whole would have really stood up, and Suchet's Doctor would have been shown just how good he could be. However, the BBC press office would have announced in January of 2011 that season 48 would be Suchet's second and final season as the Doctor, and a film would follow in season 48, which would be released in December 2011. This would sadden fans, how it would be understandable due to Suchet's age. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed season 47 of Doctor Who. Next up is the Leftover movie, which will be entitled Leftover End of Days, where it will feature Katie, Sarah, Jo, Liz and Mel, as well as Angela appearing as the Prime Minister, and the mysterious return of Henrik. The winner of the season 48 story competition will be announced in the season 47 response livestream, which will happen shortly after the upload of this video. Until then, goodbye.